All right, so everybody, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. If you're listening to us for the first time, please like, subscribe, and share. We have a special guest on here, and I'm always love having him on. He's amazing. He is a truth teller on economic issues. This is Professor Richard Wolff. You can find more about him on rdwoolff.com and on YouTube at Democracy at Work. Professor Wolff, always a pleasure. I love having you on.
All right, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so we're almost into 1 year in the Biden administration. What is your opinion of the administration so far?
Well, I find myself agreeing, if I understand them, with the polls. And by that, I mean I am underwhelmed, would be the best way to put it. Now, partly that may not be fair. I was certainly among the people very happy to see Mr. Trump go away. And I had hoped that Mr. Biden would make the kind of big changes that I had hoped for. But what I've learned is that his notion of a big change and my notion of a big change are a big distance apart. So to be more precise, I really think that he misled us. Whether he did it on purpose or not, I don't know, and I don't really care. But he misled us to think that he might be another Franklin Roosevelt, that he might make the big changes now that Roosevelt did indeed make back in the 1930s. But when I saw what his proposals were, and then when I saw him compromise most of them away, the initial proposals were not enough, and the compromise made them into a joke, and not a good one either. So, for me, let me put it this way. I was born in Ohio. I've lived and worked all my life in the United States. We are living through the worst crisis in the history, I believe, of this country. We've had viruses that have been very, very bad. The so-called Spanish flu back in 1918 killed almost as many people as the COVID has done now. And we were a much smaller country, so that was a much bigger percentage of us as a nation. And we had the Great Depression in the 1930s. But in 2020 and now in 2021, we've had something we never had before. We've had the worst public health disaster in our history at the same time that we've had the second worst economic crash in our history. Those two happening together and each one worsening the other one, that calls for a massive response, and we just haven't seen it. And, I understand Mr. Biden didn't get an overwhelming majority in the House and the Senate. I get that. But, he could have and he should have done something he hasn't done. And for that, I cannot forgive. I just can't. If you don't have a big enough majority, then you go to the people. That's your strength. I want to remind everybody who's watching this and thinking about what we're talking about, that if you go back and look at newsreels or check the newspapers back in the 1930s, you will see that President Roosevelt had a very important ally. It was the CIO, the Union Drive. It was two socialist parties. It was a communist party. And you know what those institutions did? They had people in the streets every day. You could not spend a week in Pittsburgh or in Cincinnati or in Chicago or in Dallas or almost anywhere else without seeing people carrying signs perfectly peacefully, walking down the street saying, we are hungry, we are homeless, we need help. There can't be a handful of rich people, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to see who can sit in a rocket ship for 9 minutes going around the planet. We're not going to let that happen. We are here and telling you, you better do something, or we may do things other than march peacefully in the street. We don't have that. Our president did not call us into the streets. He did not turn neither to the churches, nor the labor unions, nor the social organizations and say, come on, mobilize the American people. That's why you have this strange situation where when you ask polling, the overwhelming majority of the people want a whole lot of things that the Congress is not letting the president do. All right, now deal with that. Bring those people where you have a huge majority, bring them into the political process. The Democratic Party establishment, like Mr. Biden, cannot do it, doesn't want to do it, and is basically willing to give up what needs to be done just not to rock the boat. And my final point, that's what distinguishes them from Mr. Trump. He is willing to push the envelope. He is willing to bring his minority of supporters into the streets, into the public eye, into the Capitol on January 6th, wherever it takes to shake things up. And the Democrats look like, they're just not, they're not present. And that is the worst of it all.
Well, you talked about the crumbs, Professor, with the Build Back Better Act, which started out at $10 trillion from Bernie Sanders as the budget director. Then it went down to $4 trillion, which Joe Manchin actually endorsed $4 trillion. No one talks about that on the news. Then it went to 3.5. Now it's down to like 1.7, and he's trying to scale it down even more. So it's just crumbs. The time for change was back in 2020, like you stated. There was people marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter, which was important, but they should also geared it to labor and fighting for high wages and stuff. It seems like since then, everything kind of faded away. Joe Biden got into office. He hasn't done diddly squat in plain English. And it's really sad because the progressive movement, I think, is pretty dead in this country. And the only survival of that progressive movement, and I want you to talk about this, is these Kellogg's workers, is these John Deere workers, hospital workers, people at Amazon that are trying to start unions. That is the progressive movement, not Bernie Sanders, not Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi. These are the people that are fighting to keep that alive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And let me play a little historical game. If you were a right winger, you better be very worried about this, because working class people that have taken it on the chin for the last 40 years, if those become mobilized, if what you just talked about is the opening salvo, if you like, of a growing movement, that will do more to squash the right wing than anything else. And you can see even the beginnings of a split in the right wing as they confront this. You're seeing, not that they're to be trusted, they aren't, and not that they're honest, they're not that either. But they smell that they better be on the side of working class people, because if they're not, they're going to lose. They're going to lose everything. And I can see it in Florida's Mario, Rubio. People like that. They're beginning to move over. You can see it in Europe, for example. In France, there's a split. Here's what can happen in America. They had a Donald Trump. It's a woman named Marine Le Pen. She's the right winger. Well, guess what? Over the last year, Marine Le Pen has watched while a movement of the working class called the Yellow Vests mobilized in France and were very, very popular, way more popular than their president, Mr. Macron, who currently polls 23% support of people, and their next presidential election is in April of this coming year. Okay, so what happened is a split in the right wing. Marine Le Pen now has a competing right winger who is Donald Trump, because what she did is she came out in favor of rising wages, and she came out in favor of lowering the retirement age to give younger people more jobs by allowing the older ones to retire with a government pension sooner. This made her very popular among working class people. She understands that's where the next movement is coming. And so she wanted to cash in. Now there's a new candidate, and you'll laugh. His name is Eric Zemmour. And I'm only telling you this because I think it's the future of the United States. Mm-hmm. He is exactly Donald Trump. He opened his campaign by saying, and I'm quoting to you now, immigrants are rapists, murderers, and that's all they are. That's his quote, right? He's a TV personality, just like Trump. So he's coming out, but the difference between him and Marine Le Pen is he says, I'm the support for big corporations. What big corporations do is wonderful. So he's big, he loves capitalism. He's not for the workers. And the right wing is split about 60-40 for Le Pen versus 40% for him among right wingers. That dooms them in the election. They can't win that way. And my guess is that's coming here too. And the more we get working class action, and I'd like to call out, votes are being counted today in Buffalo, New York. Workers at Starbucks have tried to form a union, a whole bunch of them in the Buffalo, New York area. If that wins, and even if it doesn't, we should be aware there are 9,000 Starbucks outlets in the United States. None of them has a union. The average pay for a Starbucks worker, according to Starbucks, is $12 an hour. Try to live on 12, and that's before they take out your taxes and all the rest of it. So it's unbelievable, and I think you're going to see real labor movement coming, and that's going to change American politics very basically.
Yeah, I know Bernie came out for those Starbucks workers in Buffalo, and he did a rally with them. You know, what you're speaking about in France is, like you said, I'm worried about that happening in this country. And I know you were on Jimmy Dore recently, and I watched that segment, and you talked about vaccine mandates and how they hurt labor. The vaccine mandates in New York City, where you're at, and Bill de Blasio is starting to put them in place, are not only going to hurt they're going to hurt the working folk of New York. And these mandates all around the country are hurting working people that are working at the Starbucks, at the McDonald's, and in places like that. Are you worried about that these vaccine mandates are going to push people toward the right?
Absolutely. You know, I'm in favor of vaccines.
Right.
I want to be real clear. I'm vaccinated. My children are vaccinated. My wife is vaccinated, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I do that because I think it protects me, and I urge other people to get vaccinated to protect their own health. But that's a different matter from mandating something. Look, we live in a society where the pharmaceutical companies have done unspeakable damage. I won't spend a lot of your time, but Purdue Pharma is responsible for the whole opioid,
crisis,
destruction of this country. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have killed themselves by overdose of these drugs. It's an unregulated business. The people who take these drugs don't know what they might have been mixed with. There's no government over. I mean, it's an unspeakable horror. And we know that pharmaceuticals are always putting profits as number one, which they tell us it's the bottom line. It's the measure of their stock success in the market, blah, blah, blah. Well, we ought to be suspicious about what they tell us. And our politicians have been telling us what to do. Now, American working people don't trust the government, and they don't trust corporate executives, and they don't trust them for damn good reasons. Right. Here's the bottom line. There's no need for a mandate. Mandates are something workers have fought against in this country for a century. We don't want to be told what to do by those people in high office, especially not when it comes to things that are our job to do, taking care of our health and so on. So, I mean, let me quote to you. Sarah Nelson is the head of the flight attendants union in this country. She's a real rising star in the labor movement. She worked out with the airlines how they're going to handle vaccines. There was no mandate. It was something that the management of the companies, the airplane companies, and the leaders of the union sat down to work out. When that was done, they got everybody vaccinated who didn't have a medical condition or a religious exemption or something like that. There's no need for it. Bill de Blasio could have and should have, as a mayor, let alone a Democrat, let alone a progressive, which he said he was, he could have and should have sat down a year ago to work out with the public employee unions, because they're all unionized here in New York. The cops, the fire, the social workers, the clerks, they all have unions. They're all used to sitting down with the mayor and the government officials to work things out. He didn't do that. That's on him. But you can't come in now and tell everybody what to do, because that means you're undoing the labor union struggles to have a voice at the workplace, and they shouldn't allow that to be taken away. And the excuse of having a pandemic is not an adequate basis when you could have, you should have, and you can still now sit down and work out how to get a proper vaccine. The unions are getting a bad rap. Most of the unions I know, and I work with them, they're not against vaccines. That's just not true. They're not right-wingers. They're not opposed, but they want this to be done in a way that respects individuals and unions and working people.
In Rhode Island, they're paying state workers $3,000 to get the vaccine. $3,000 that could be money going elsewhere to help homeless people, to help people with disabilities. So if you don't get the vaccine in Rhode Island, if you get it, if you don't have it already, you get $3,000. It's insanity.
Yeah, it is. And the amount of money that's being paid to Pfizer and Moderna and the others by the United States government per dosage, that is going to cripple the government. That's why it's going into debt as deeply as it is to pay these pharmaceuticals who are raking in wild amounts. This stinks from here to tomorrow. And you can't whitewash the whole thing by keep talking about, oh, we're curing people of a disease. What you're doing is using that, which has some merit, to cover a multitude of sins. And I think Americans smell it and they see it and they are not happy. And look, the left should be here saying, you're right, we don't want that we want working people in every workplace to be given the right to sit down and work out an acceptable vaccination program. No mandates. If they came in and did that, the movement of people angry would see allies on the left to work with. But at this point, they don't see that. They see the Democrats piling on with mandates like de Blasio, like Biden, and the only way to express your anger is to go to the right, which means working people are going to the right, which is why Rubio and other right-wing politicians are smelling votes they can get there and are going a little bit toward that.
I want to go into the inflation argument. I think it's a lot of foolishness and garbage because we're seeing the 1% making profits over profits, and they're just blaming everything on COVID and shortages. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and it's very important because it's a basic economic lesson. And I think in a very few words, I can get that across.
Okay.
Okay, what people forget when they read about an inflation are the simple truths about it. First, all that the word inflation means is a general increase in prices. Not that every price goes up the same amount, but that, your bread costs a bit more and a gallon of gas in your car costs a bit more and your haircut costs a bit more and all of that, okay? So now let's begin with economics. Who sets prices in a capitalist economy? Very important. Answer: a tiny minority of people. We call them employers. If you've ever been an employee, you will have noticed that your job description does not include setting the price of whatever it is you help to produce. That's not your right. That's not your job. The boss does that. The employer decides whether the price will go up, whether the price will go down, whether the price will stay the same. Okay, employers are 1 or 2% of our people. The other 98% are employees. Okay, so first thing to understand, an inflation is the result of the behavior of a minority that is imposed on the majority who have to pay the prices. Second economic reality. Why do employers raise prices? The answer is they do that for the same reason they do everything else. Buy a machine, rent a truck, change the organization of the office, whatever they do. Whether or not they've gotten an MBA from a business school, they have learned profit is the bottom line. Whether or not you raise a price is determined by whether you think it'll be profitable or not. If you think it won't, you don't do it. And if you think it will, you do it. That's it. That's what you learn. So we now know a tiny minority determines the price of everything, not the workers and not the government, the employer. And the reason they do it is profit. So here's the answer which economics teaches. You want to understand why there's an inflation? It's because businessmen and women are either raising their profits or protecting their profits by changing the price. And there it is. And I would argue in this current situation, most American businesses had some difficulties in 2020 and in 2021. They didn't get the profits. They had to shut down. They had to tell their workers not to come to work. They had special problems. They had to fix things. They had to put ventilators into the work areas. They had a lot of expenses and they didn't do as much of a business. They want to make up the profits they didn't get over the last 2 years. And they decided that raising prices now is a way to do that. And that's why we have an inflation. Blaming the workers is a stupid joke. blaming the shortages misunderstands. We don't have rising prices because there are shortages. It's exactly the other way around. When the prices go up, a whole bunch of adjustments are made. If I'm a business and I have to pay higher prices for my inputs, my oil, my gas, my raw material, whatever it is, I'm going to be a little bit hesitant to do that. I'm not going to keep a fat inventory of those things because it's expensive now. The prices are going up. I'm worried. I'm not, So everybody is adjusting. That's why you have supply chain interruption. Sure, the pandemic adds to that. I understand. But what you're doing is you're using a small additional factor because you want to keep the people from understanding it's the profit-driven capitalist system that is rewarding the American people, having just gone through the worst public health disaster in a century and the worst economic crash in a century. Here's your reward, an inflation on top of it, with your wages not rising anywhere near as fast as your prices. It's another way to stick it to the working class. And that's what should be exposed here, rather than coming up with magical explanations. You don't need that. An inflation is a simple thing.
Professor Richard Wolff here on Fire Breathing Rob. Professor, I want to talk about this because this leads into the next topic of the labor market. We've been hearing a lot about this tight labor market, and we just had a jobs report that came out, 210,000 new jobs. It was pretty abysmal in general. And the unemployment rate went down to 4.6. They're all running around saying, this is great. The unemployment is down. It's the lowest it's been since 1969 or some other year or whatever it may be. Can you talk about how this is all misleading in general?
Sure. There's two ways that it's misleading. The first one is a matter of how the statistics are organized. And the second one is what the reality is. So let me start with statistics organized. The pandemic added on to what had already been a remarkable event going back to at least 2008 and 9. We have had a shrinkage in what is called labor force participation. The percentage of our adult, healthy Americans who are either working or looking for a job. We have had millions. My estimate is between 6 and 10 million Americans over the last decade have quit. They're not working in the regular economy. They are either going back to depending on other people, a housewife who goes back into home maintenance rather than a job and depends for money income on her husband. That's one kind. Another one are men and women who are in fact working, but under the table. So they disappear statistically because they're now doing something illegal in order to escape the law or taxes or whatever motivates them. So it is deceptive to count as unemployed, which is what the government does, only the people who don't have a job but are looking for one. When people say, I'm not looking for one, I don't have a job, but I'm not looking, they are not considered to be in the labor force. So they're not counted. If you counted them as unemployed, which many of them are, then our unemployment number would be much, much larger. So keep in mind, this number is useful for politicians in office and for commentators who don't want to face or admit how serious our problems have become. Because remember, if millions of people who used to work aren't working anymore, those people are still eating, those people are still wearing clothes, those people are still living in home. They are consuming what we produce, but they're not adding to what we produce. That's not a good, healthy thing for a society. If you did it as a matter of public policy to give people more leisure, that'd be something else. But we all know that's not what's going on here. Now, the second comment. We are seeing a revolt. When you spoke earlier about the Kellogg workers, the John Deere workers, the Nabisco workers, the writers out in Hollywood, all of those, the workers at Starbucks in the Buffalo area, we are seeing record numbers of people quitting their jobs and record numbers of people striking for a better job. You better understand that's the reality of the labor movement. And it's a sign that workers did some thinking while they were off the job. They took a look because they had to. They had to stay home. They had to worry about their children who couldn't go to school. They had to worry about whether the job they left would be there when they got back. They had to wonder, what did the employer do while we were not working? Maybe the employer changed some of the conditions of our job. Maybe the job we go back to isn't as good as the job we left because the employer wants to economize because he got hurt in the crash too. For all these reasons, workers going back took a look at these jobs. And if you will allow me to quote a famous song from a few years ago, they said to themselves and to the rest of us, take this job and shove it. Because if you remember, that song was a big country and Western hit. That's what Americans are doing. And again, it goes to your earlier point that there's a movement in the American working class that we ought to pay a lot of attention to and that we ought to give a lot of support and compassion to, because it is working people beginning to say they will not tolerate to continue to be abusively treated the way they have for the last 30 years. They didn't just go through a pandemic and a crash in order to be confronted with an inflation. If Mr. Biden doesn't do something about that, he is going to be swept away in the anger of a working class that wanted him to make it better rather than preside lamely over things getting worse.